Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builders Supply, and this video is to bring you a closer look at the Bommer. This is their part number BB5040-450-600. This is basically a raised barrel hinge, is what it is. That 4 in the part number tells us that it's a raised barrel hinge, and that's what that raised barrel hinge looks like. Okay, it's an otherwise standard hinge, except that it's significantly different. There'd really be nothing preventing you from using this on a standard door and frame, but you really wouldn't, because there'd be no reason to use it. What makes this hinge different is the fact that the vertical axis of pivoting has been modified. Obviously, normally a hinge is going to have that vertical axis of pivoting over towards this way, but the reason that you would use a raised barrel hinge is if you were attaching your door to a frame where the door position was going to be substantially inset into the frame. Okay, if you used a standard hinge, that hinge barrel would bury itself into the rabbet or the soffit or cased portion of the frame itself, would not allow you to get the hinge installed. So basically what's done is the vertical axis of pivoting, or the center line of the barrel, is just kicked over this way, getting it out of the way so that you can basically, if my hand represented, my flat hand represented the frame, you can get that installed. Okay? That's why that is the way it is. It's a raised barrel hinge. Where do people use a raised barrel hinge? Well, when they're attaching a door to a frame and the door is substantially, again, inset into the opening. Let's see if we can illustrate that literally here. Okay, so if we have an unusual circumstance where we have a cased opening frame, but we want to put a door into it, except that the door needs to reside, let's say, deep inside of here. Okay, a standard hinge is not going to really permit that to work at all, because a standard hinge is meant, whether it's a cased opening frame or if it's a double rabbeted frame, doesn't matter. The hinge is meant to reside here with the leaves and the door existing here. It's just that in a situation where you need a raised barrel hinge, the door is going to reside in such a position where the barrel, if we used a standard hinge, would need to reside here. So in our scenario where we have a application that requires a hinge to have that vertical axis of pivoting kicked out like this, okay, then our door. I mean, in obviously an exaggerated situation, but there you go. That's what it's for. So people, when they're installing a door to a gate structure or to a frame where it's substantially inset like this, that's where a raised barrel is going to come in. Now, the inset of a frame is measured, if I had a standard door, inset is measured from the face of the door to that frame right there. That small little dimension inside of there is the inset. Now, sometimes the door and frame are flush. Aluminum storefront are very often flush. They're also very often inset. Hollow metal doors are, as a rule, inset. 3/32 of an inch, something in that range. But if you had a scenario where, for all intents and purposes, your inset was anything greater than 3/16 of an inch or so, you're going to need a raised barrel hinge to give you the ability to take that hinge and attach it right down to the frame. All the mechanics of how the door operates are still the same. The fact that the vertical axis of pivoting is here and not basically here doesn't change the net width of the door, doesn't change how how the door swings, doesn't change the requirement of clearance between the edge of the door and frame. The only thing that it would very, very slightly modify is when you are templating hardware. A lot of hardware is margined off the vertical axis of pivoting of the hinge, and that's where that dimension is taken from. For instance, if you were going to install a door closer, it's margined off the center line, so you would make that small adjustment, but that's the only adjustment I can think of. And that's where you're going to use this raised barrel hinge. Now, this client in particular was literally building a gate, and he was literally putting a door into that gate and needed a raised barrel hinge because he could not take his jam post, which was 4x4 3/16 steel. There was nothing he could do to this jam post to make a hinge work. So anyway, a raised barrel hinge is exactly what allowed him to solve his problem. So now that we've talked about where you're going to use the hinge, now you've got an idea of where to apply it. You'll see it in residential applications all the time as well. A common residential application is when someone has ordered a wood door and a frame, patio doors and frames for residential applications, 4 9/16 jams, whatever the size is, and they go to the job site and put these suckers in and realize, oh, the jams are too small. We should have ordered 5 1/4. Well, they'll add a jam extension, okay, to the opening, and while that makes the frame look cohesive and for all intents and purposes solves the problem, because ordering new doors and frames are not the answer for that scenario, sometimes when you are mounting the material on the pull side of the opening where that jam extension is, which is just wood that's been applied to the face of the frame, you need a raised barrel hinge, because now where your hinge was going to reside no longer is giving you enough real estate to install your hinge normally. Let's dissect the part number, and dissecting the part number requires a trip to the Bommer full line catalog, where it's helpful because when we look at the matrix of how to order, we can very easily determine how to put a proper hinge together. So let's do so now. Okay, from the manufacturer's page in the site, which is here or found at the link to the manufacturers, you'll be able to pull up the entire the Bommer manufacturer page and click on product catalog, and sure enough, that catalog is going to come up, and we get down to a page not too terribly far into the catalog, page AH5, or the 23rd page of this document, and that's where we're going to be able to build our part number. So BB stands for ball bearing, okay, and you can see how the rest of this is built. We have a 50/40 is what we have. So we have a 5-knuckle hinge that is full mortise, that is raised barrel, that is standard weight and steel. So you can see as we manipulate these numbers in these specific columns, we're going to manipulate the hinge completely. It's the DNA of the hinge. So this is a 450 in the size, 450, and that means full mortise, 4.5, 4.5. Okay. There is no door option after that. If we were to have put something there, you know, in any of these areas, we'll modify the hinge. The most common option is the N for non-removable pin, so it would be 450N. And then these odd derivatives of hinges, anchor and slip-in hinges. Slip-in hinges are very common for aluminum storefront, old-style aluminum storefront, and that has to be ordered correctly based on what leaf is tapped and what leaf is not tapped, or if both leaves are tapped. Square door, beveled door, or short leaf. Square and beveled have everything to do with swing clear hinges. They need to know how to bend that hinge to get it to work correctly. Ball tip, hospital tip are here. Security stud, that's an interesting method of non-removable components when you can't slide the hinge leaves apart. Maximum security stud as well as a variant on that. You'll see those types of security measures in prisons. You will see them in airport terminals where non-removable pin is used in conjunction with these other safety measures. Then down over here, any electrified options would be here, defined as here. And then, of course, finally your finish. Bommer is proud to say that they can do 33, I forget the number, it's 33 or 34 finishes. They have their own finishing plant and are very proud as to how great of a job their finishing plant does. We are unfortunately just looking at a 600 hinge, which is prime coat. So that's what the hinge looks like. Now let's take a look at how this all affects what the hinge actually looks like when we get it in our hand. We talked about it initially being ball bearing, and indeed it is. It's a ball bearing hinge. We've got 2 bearing packets here, and that's standard for a standard weight hinge. If this was a heavyweight, you'd have 4 bearing packets. The 5 means that it's full mortise, and that means when we bring the leaves together, they're meant, when they're brought together parallel, they're meant to be mortised to the edge of the door and the frame, allowing that typical margin between the two. That would be the 0 in the part number, the 5-0. I jumped over a number, forgive me. The first 5 means 5 knuckle. You can use your imagination and see why it's 5 knuckle. Then it's full mortise. Then it's a 4 in the part number, that's raised barrel. We talked about that already. And then it's a 0 after that. That means that it's made of steel. Okay, it's standard weight as well, and made of steel. And that means on a 4.5-inch hinge, we're going to talk about the size next. It's 134 thousandths leaf thickness. My caliper tells me 0.137. So the 450 means it's 4.5, 4.5. That means that this hinge is 4.5 inches tall. The first dimension in this hinge is the height. The second dimension would be the width. Because this is a raised barrel hinge, it's going to not measure any differently than a standard hinge. It's 4.5 inch wide. But what's really important to take away from 4.5 by 4.5 is the height is the first dimension. That's the most important dimension on a hinge. It tells us how we're going to prep the door and frame. It tells us possibly how thick the door is. It tells us what size the door might be in terms of the duty that it's expected to handle. So what I mean by all that is if I have a door and frame and I need to make the door and frame for a 4.5 hinge, my prep will be 4.5 tall. If I have a 4.5 by 4, a very common hinge, it's important to know that I'm prepping 4.5 tall and not 4 inch tall. The hinge prep doesn't care if it's 4.5 by 4.5, 4.5 by 4, 4.5 by 7. It does 4.5 by 100. The hinge prep in the door and frame doesn't matter, but that's the first dimension. The width of the hinge is less important when it comes to defining the hinge, even though that is still important because it tells us more about the unit itself. So be mindful that if you are dealing with hinges, not all hinges are square. 4.5 by 4, again, very common. 4.5 by 6, very common. 5 by 4.5, super common. 6 by 5, 6 by 4.5. All of this can be made, so be mindful. 4 by 3.5 is not an unheard of hinge. 3.5 by 3, that exists as well for certain instances. When you want to draw the vertical axis of pivoting closer to the face of the door, you'll use that 4.5 by 4. Very common in aluminum storefront. And actually in a lot of hollow metal doors and hollow metal frames, architectural wood doors and hollow metal frames, a 4.5 by 4 versus 4.5, 4.5, if you are wrapping the wall with a frame, and there is no reason to have that vertical axis of pivoting hanging out further off the face of the frame, use a 4.5 by 4. It's a cleaner look, brings the vertical axis of pivoting closer to the door and frame. The hinge is therefore more, it's more economical for the hinge to do its job. Less projecting hardware into the opening as well. I crack my watch on things all day long as I walk through the shop, and I've cracked my watch on the knuckle of a barrel when I'm walking down a corridor. And not this watch, a watch that was a lot more expensive to repair. Keep that projecting hardware to a minimum when you can, okay? Then this is a 600 hinge. Prime coat over steel. Again, 33 finishes. You can't have every finish on, they do polished brass. That counts for 2. Polished brass on steel, polished brass on brass. So be mindful. There's some overlap there as well. But when you have your own plating plant, you're capable of doing some stuff. There's no doubt. So that dissects our part number. And we talked about where we're going to use the hinge, when you would use it. Information down below tells us that this is for medium weight type of average frequency doors. You know, you have altered the hinge design. You've put a huge swag on the hinge leaf here to accommodate moving that barrel over. So you're really not going to toss this into a scenario where you're hanging a 4080 16 gauge hollow metal door. You're going to need to beef the hinge up, to say the least. Medium weight, 125 pound, medium frequency. Okay, used where doors are set deep into a wide frame. That's what we've discussed. Can be mortised or surface mounted to the jamb. You will vary in that gate scenario. This is going to be surface mounted, is just simply the bottom line. You could also mortise it should you want to. It's a steel hinge with a steel pin. It's a template pattern, and let's now take a look at the what they call the cut sheet. Let's take a look at the cut sheet of this hinge. Now, we were just reading through the extended description information here, and we'll just finish that off before we get to the cut sheet. We talked about it being ball bearing, 5-knuckle. Non-rising pin is standard. That doesn't mean it's a non-removable pin. It's just non-rising in the sense that it does not give in to the same sort of forces when you see a door in a frame and it's hinged. And that hinge pin seems to always work its way out and move up rather than fall out of the bottom. That is a rising pin. It's like the barrels work to extrude the pin out of the top. Well, there is knurling done on the hinge pin of this hinge. So when the hinge pin is driven down, that knurling bites into the inside of the barrel itself, preventing it from being rising. A button tip pin is used. Let's jump down to the decorative tips. You can do decorative tips, acorn, ball, or steeple on this, but the standard tip is called a button tip. If you use your imagination, it looks like the button on your coat. That's why we call it that. Used on 1 3/4 thick doors. You can use it on thicker doors. You're just going to have a much larger hinge back set. 134 thousandths, 8 holes. Let's now click on the cut sheet. And the cut sheet shows us very elegantly what this looks like when it's installed, either surface mounted or mortised. You can see how that drives the vertical axis of pivoting away. That's just an overview of what we're dealing with. Unusual inset is what the bottom line is, a 3/4 inch inset. Imagine if your frame normally stopped here, but then you added that jamb extension. Voila, voila, you need a raised barrel hinge. The template. Now, the location of the holes for the screws is considered the template pattern. The term template can be used to refer to a technical drawing or giving you installation instructions otherwise. It's also a reference to the actual physical locations of where those holes have been prepped in the hinge leaf. So if someone says it's a template pattern 4.5, 4.5, regardless of who the manufacturer is, it's going to be at these locations. Okay? Half circle, moon pattern, whatever people want to call it. That's a template pattern, and they will always be in these locations if it's template pattern. Down here refers to the other variants of this. That LB is a 3-knuckle hinge. You can do this in a 3-knuckle hinge. The 0 means steel. If you change it to a 1, you'll get bronze or brass, depending on what finish you're doing. You want stainless steel, they can do that. Just change that to a 2, and you'll get stainless steel. It's a really great document. It shows what the intended application is. You can do radiused corners. Square corner is common, is standard. I've had people order these in radiused corner. They just, that's what they had. I had a guy in Amsterdam or somewhere in that part of Europe, I forget, order heavyweight raised barrel 5/8 radius, solid brass, polished brass, non-removable pin. That's what he wanted. That's what he got. Beautiful hinge. Okay? Some old photographs of kind of what it looks like, just to help illustrate how that kicks it away a little bit. Now, let's wrap up this video. Now, along with these hinges being in the template pattern, screws will be included. You're going to get all wood screws and all machine screws. That's not always the case. You don't always get all wood and all machine screws. Sometimes you get all machine and half wood. screws. They will be in a complementary finish. Sometimes they'll send them out as chrome. Their logic is, well, you've ordered a prime coat hinge, you're going to paint the hinge. Who cares what the head of the screw looks like? Well, sometimes they do that, and that's not really been a problem. I would prefer if they were always just prime coated to match the hinge. If you have need for certain screws, be sure to indicate that. Let us know all wood screws. Let us know all machine screws or half and half. That way at least the factory understands your requirement, and you won't find out that it's a wood door and a wood frame, and industry standard is to give you half wood screws and all metal screws, and the metal screws are of no use to you. And now you're wondering where to get screws. So indicate that, and the factory will be happy to oblige. Very common with Bomber is they will send shims. This is just cardboard. They're cardboard shims to help you take that hinge leaf and move it either way. However, you might need to tip that, cant the hinge, shim it somehow, move it away from the jamb or the door, whatever the case might be. Be mindful. Don't use cardboard shims or any shims other than steel on a fire-rated door. That would be a violation of the fire rating integrity of the opening itself. And I suppose lastly, or second to last, the Bomber logo, and right above it, it says Made in USA, a fact that Bomber is incredibly proud of, as am I to represent them. They have been in business from about 1876. I'm guessing it's really close to there. The gentleman who owns Bomber currently is the husband of the granddaughter. Two brothers. Yeah, that makes sense. This gentleman is elderly, but is married into the family, is the husband of the granddaughter of one of the two original brothers, and they invented the spring hinge. The name Bomber is synonymous with spring hinges. There is a link below this video to the manufacturer's page where you can get to not only all of the Bomber products that we sell, but a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to other encyclopedic documents are there. I do have a Bomber catalog dating to about 1950. It will be scanned and added here as well for your review. Bomber at one time was a major player in postal specialties. They've, in about maybe late 2018 or 2019, discontinued that entire line, moved out of that business altogether. There's just no money in it to have incredibly high-quality mailboxes, according to Bomber, that people were unwilling to pay for, which is a shame because in certain major areas, like Chicago, Bomber is everywhere. And now there's just nowhere to get locks, replacement doors, key keepers, a new mailbox because they love the Bomber product, etc. But such is the way of life. If you have any questions on the Bomber BB5040 in a 450 size and a 600 finish, or any other Bomber product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you very much.